Welcome back to the county seat. We are continuing our conversation, a look at the aftermath of the Brian Head fire. And we wanted to take a little bit of historical context because it's not the first fire. It won't be the last fire that has an impact. And so in our continuing conversation about this, we wanted to go back and look at the relationships between the different agencies, local, state, and federal, and how they interact in a fire. Joining us for our conversation is a former county commissioner who is involved very closely on the ground in the shingle fire that took place up near Duck Creek about, 4 years before Brian Head?
Probably 4 years before Brian Head.
So we welcome Doug Heaton, former commissioner from Kane County. Doug, I wanted to talk to you about the fire that happened up in Duck Creek. You had county crews on hand when that was, just 100 or 200 acres, very early on?
Less than that, actually. It got started and we were at 10 or 15 acres and we knew the fire was going on. We didn't have cats on the site, but we had, they could be there in just a matter of an hour or so. So we did have some equipment available, yes.
So kind of walk me through what happened and why that fire didn't get the attention it needed at Caterpillars when it was 15 acres.
We had the ability, and we had operators, and we called the forester and said we want to put our cats on the fire, and the response was, we can't have you doing that. And we said, well, why? And the response was, your operators and your equipment are not approved on the federal approved equipment list or operators list. They have to be carded. The operators have to be carded. I understand the need for safety, but they simply would not allow ours because we had not pre-approved the equipment or the man who would have been running that equipment.
So that's like saying if there was a fire, a pumper from Midvale that happened to be in downtown Salt Lake on hand at a fire, they couldn't put the fire out.
If it were a different agency and they were not approved by the agency, in that case, the answer is no.
So
was no. I hope it's changed, but I don't think it has.
So, let's talk through that. Let's talk through that scenario. Did you finally put those cats on that fire?
No. I argued and said, look, we can stop this now, or at least we have a good shot at stopping this now. And I said, give me one good reason other than the fact that they're not approved, why we can't do this. And she said, well, and finally she said, okay, you can go around the fire, but you can only go 1 blade wide and 2 inches deep. And I said, why? And she said, because we have artifacts that we need to protect.
Were the artifacts only in the path where you were going to cut the swath?
Well, we don't know where they were. I don't think they knew where they were. They just knew that there was a possibility that there could be some there, and they were willing to sacrifice the forest for the artifacts. At least that's the way it appeared to me.
How big did that fire become?
8,000 acres plus.
So it went from 15 to 8. In comparison to the size of Brian Head, that's small.
Small.
But it seemed to be, it was filled with some problems.
It looked really big to the subdivision that it nearly took out.
Have there been other cases of this in the West that you're aware of?
Yeah, we have a documented case in Montana where they have probably one of the best helicopter crews in the United States. They are good at what they do. Montana has lots of forests, and this is a crack helicopter crew that was stopped from participating in the big fires they had up there because they were not on the federal register, the approved federal list of equipment.
So how does the federal government rationalize that decision? What do they say in response to saying, well, they're not federally registered? And you say, yeah, well, they're obviously experienced. They know what they're doing.
It's a state crew.
It's a state crew.
Yeah.
So what is their response?
It's kind of like bureaucratic rule overrules common sense, in my mind. It's the only way I could look at it. They obviously had the ability. Part of the problem, I think, and this is just me speaking, but I think part of the problem is the public lands, the forest in particular, has become a huge maintenance backlog to the Forest Service. And so you got a number of dynamics going on here, and I'm going to get in trouble probably for even saying this. But you've got firefighters who do that for a living, and I think they're a little bit territorial. You've got a federal government who is managed from Washington, D.C. The forests are managed basically from Washington. And so these local people, I think, don't have entire latitude to do what they would like to do. And then you've got a huge maintenance backlog, and quite frankly, the fire takes care of some of that. So by the maintenance backlog, what I mean is you've got forests that are choked and overgrown by a massive amount of just tree numbers on land that will probably support 70 trees per acre healthy, and now you got 700. Every tree drinks a bunch of water, and so what we end up with is the springs dry up, and then as soon as there just isn't enough water, then the trees begin to die. They can no longer combat against the beetle, and then we have these standing dead forests. It's a problem, and it's a big problem for the Forest Service. It's an eyesore, and they end up catching a lot of flack for that. But if you have a big enough fire, that goes away, right?
Well, that's true, and I think it's interesting that both the shingle fire and the Brian Head fire are taking place on the same terrain, on the same piece of property, in the same forest that Congressman Jim Hansen, when he was still a congressman, said it's a disaster waiting to happen, and he thought it was going to be the biggest catastrophic wildfire in the West. And in some ways, it looks like it was close to that.
It is a big problem. But look, there are solutions. If you want to stop this thing from happening again, we're doing all the things wrong that we ought to be doing. For example, if you really want to have the ability to fight a fire, you need to have in place all of the elements of firefighting to be able to fight that fire. Roads need to be opened. No, actually they're closing them, okay? So that all of the little access roads that you access the forest in are now being systematically shut down and closed, even to firefighting crews. They're put to sleep, like huge boulders and bar ditches that don't let you get there from here. So, first of all, we ought to have it so that the forest is accessible. We ought to have agreements already in place so that the local people can do what they can do. In many cases, they get there before the Forest Service, and those fires are put out before the Forest Service ever gets there.
So do you think if the county crews and the bulldozer operators, county equipment, and the county firefighters, the Duck Creek Volunteer Fire Department had the ability to do whatever they needed to do as far as containing that fire, that shingle fire would have stopped at 15 or 20 acres?
I don't know. That would be it. I mean, we had a fire, we had very dry conditions. I don't know what had happened, but we ought to at least give it a shot, had we not? Unless fire is an industry that we need to protect.
What else can be done?
Well, the interagency agreements so that we can have that thing. The ultimate solution would be to keep the forest healthy before the thing burns. Look, we can keep these forests young and vibrant forever by simply treating it like a garden rather than a museum. We can keep from burning up millions of animals in these forests, and quite frankly, that's a topic that we don't very often hear about, is the however many thousand million animals that get burned up in these larger fires. If you go sit down in the forest and watch, of course there are a few deer, a few elk, a few of the larger animals. There are dozens of the smaller ones and the birds, and no, they do not escape. They get burned up, and that's not a topic we hear about very often because it's a really uncomfortable topic to think about. But we need to think about it.
So there would be somebody who might argue that, well, if you manage the forests and you make commercial operations viable so that you can harvest, so that the Forest Service can even have a ghost chance of being able to afford to do this, and letting the commercial enterprise run some of this, well, there'll be people who say, well, you can't let them do that. You can't do selective thinning because you'll chase away the owls and you will destroy habitat for deer and elk, and so...
That's nonsense. It simply isn't true. The animal is these animals are so adaptable. When I used to work in the forest, I remember one day we were cutting aspen for economic. It was part of the economics, right?
You're
And
making money
I was
harvesting aspen.
I was cutting an aspen tree, and the deer would come out. They love aspen leaves. That's why you see them always. There are no aspen leaves below where a deer can reach, right? I was cutting this tree, and I cut it down, and I was working it. And while I was cutting the tree down, they were on the tree that I had just fallen, and the deer came out. There were two of them, eating the leaves off the tree while my chainsaw was running, and I was within less than 100 feet. And there they were, and there I was running my chainsaw. They knew what I was doing. They were at least partly accustomed to the noise. It certainly didn't terrify them. They looked perfectly calm to me. Now, shut the saw off, set it down, and now all of a sudden I looked like something different, and they left, okay? But while the chainsaw was running, I was down at the mine there, that notorious, terrible mine that's in Alton.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I was watching. I drove by, and it was like Saturday night at the movies. Deer are really curious and probably a little bored when they're not running for their lives. Okay, so here they are lined up against the fence, watching the big trucks go back and forth. I mean, 20 of them sitting there. It was like Saturday night at the movies. Are they terrified by that? If they are, then why do we run over them on the highway? Because they're always on the edge eating.
That's true.
Really dense stuff makes them really nervous because the predator can get really close. If you go down, for example, on the Kaibab National Forest, that forest was harvested from about roughly 1950 till the 90s. That is some of the most beautiful forest. Well, it was, and now it's becoming all overgrown again, and now we have a lot of density problem. But there were better trees on the Kaibab National Forest when the logging companies were expelled than there were when they began. I cut a tree one time there. I was a forester. And this tree, a pretty good sized tree, and I was feeling a little pensive that day. I cut the tree down, and I thought, I wonder how long it took to grow that. And I got looking, and for about the first 30 or 40 years, the growth rings were so close that I could hardly distinguish them. And then all of a sudden, they jump out to like a ½ inch wide. And I'm going, whoa, I wonder if we got a lot more rain in all those years. And then I looked over, and there was a big stump there about 10 feet from this tree. And you could tell the year that the big tree, was cut. Because now the little tree all of a sudden has the ability to become a big tree.
Because it's got
very
water
quickly.
And it's got light.
Because the big tree was taking all the water, the big tree was taking all the light, the little tree was barely surviving until the big tree was gone. And now all of a sudden the little tree very quickly then becomes the big tree. That is one of the most beautiful forests, and it's the trees are spacing. The tree spacing in part of that forest is still really pretty good, very healthy.
So, is there an advantage in having a forest that's got an 80-year-old tree versus a 200-year-old tree, or by the time they get to that point, do they pretty much look the same?
They look the same for a long time before they finally die and topple over. An 80-year-old tree that has had good growing conditions is a big tree. If they've had a lot of competition, they're not a big tree. So you can actually, you create an environment in the forest for the animals and for the trees themselves that are optimum by weeding the garden.
So if we had to live within the constraints of interagency public policy on forest management with the idea that we were going to try and get a hand on the preventive side of fires, and you were able to craft that policy, what would that policy be? Having experience as an industry guy and as a local elected official, how would you see an effective policy?
And an environmentalist. I love the environment, okay?
Okay.
I love the animals, I love the forest, I love the trees, I love the prairies. And I'm really interested in the well-being of all those things. What I would suggest is a policy that allows, quite frankly, I don't think you can do it from Washington, a policy that allows local management decisions by people who are on the ground and understand. Even the local foresters could do a better job if Washington were not pulling all the strings.
And would those agencies be working with other agencies in local communities in a closer fashion?
In a best world scenario, it would be a state agency that was managing the public forest.
And you think that at a state level, the forest could be managed to a point where even the cost of fire suppression could become manageable?
For every dollar that we spend managing, we can save $15 in suppression.
And 5,000?
500, I think, or
500 in
something
economic.
like that.
So it's a pretty big number.
I should have, I mean, it's the idea, not the numbers that are important here. Okay,
Yeah.
So yeah, a little bit of maintenance goes a long way. But plus, look, you've got environmental benefit, you've got community economic benefit, you've got animal health benefit and safety. Show me a loser.
Well, we forgot watershed.
Watershed. Yeah, you get 700 trees per acre. I guarantee your streams are going to dry up. Why? Because all the trees are drinking all the water. There's not going to be any water runoff. So you have the watershed benefit as well. I don't see a loser here.
So how do we get from point A to point B?
Let me tell you why I believe that this was a conversation. We were in a meeting. Regional forester was there, and we were saying, you know, the question was, how can we solve the problem? And it was after the shingle fire. And my comment was, look, the private sector is the solution. We need to weed the garden. We need to get the tree count where the tree count needs to be. And once we get that there, the forest health will kind of maintain and balance. We won't have catastrophic fires to the extent we are now. We won't risk our animals so much. We won't, our watersheds will come back. I mean, it was the economics of the community is going to be vastly improved. Well, how do we get there from here? And she said, well, what would have to happen? And I said, what would have to happen would be that we would have to have surety for our industries. Capital is a coward. You can't ask them to come in and spend $40 million putting in a facility, a mill, to process the forest product that will make the forest healthy without some assurance that there's going to be an ongoing supply of product. And the response was, we can't do that.
So we have to have a policy change at the top.
You've got to have a policy change at the top.
Or more local control.
Or you have to have the only solution, really, because people at the top have so many pressures from so many areas. You've got the really nice city-dwelling environmentalist who is honest, but just simply doesn't understand what happens to make the forest healthy. It's the Mother Nature knows best kind of thing. Mother Nature is something that was created, I'm not sure exactly how, but it's been very effective in helping us, making us, training us, that we should not interfere, because Mother Nature knows best. I don't know whether you're old enough to remember that, but I remember Mother Nature knows best. That's absolutely not true. Mother Nature provides a product which will be harvested. Either she'll harvest it or we'll harvest it. But her response to our failure to harvest is always a pretty abrupt, catastrophic response. Okay? So you can have a gentle response that takes care of the forest. And like I said, we can keep these forests young and healthy and vibrant forever if we just manage them like a garden, not like a museum. The problem Washington's got is they've got people who do not understand that, and there's so much pressure from people who really have a lot of money. Because well-meaning environmental type people from the cities, they send lots of money to these environmental people, these environmental organizations that are designed to shut down exactly what I'm talking about. For them, it is absolutely heresy for me to speak like I'm speaking.
Well, I hope that you're secure and safe on your way home.
I'm fine.
Doug, thank you so much for taking the time. We'll be back to look on the ground. We will next take a peek at what the personal costs are when fire comes through a community like it did at Panguitch Lake in the Brian Head Fire. We'll be right back with the county seat in just a minute.